The night was suffocatingly quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the street in darkness, save for the weak, flickering light of a distant street lamp. A fine layer of snow had covered the street, the white powder glistening faintly under the dim light. The trees lining the street were bare, their skeletal branches reaching up toward the sky like twisted hands, shivering in the wind. The wind itself howled through the empty street, carrying with it the chill of the night and the whisper of something sinister, something unnatural. The street was deserted, not a single car in sight, not a single soul. It was as if the world had gone to sleep, leaving nothing but an eerie void in its wake. The only sound that could be heard was the soft, crunching footsteps of a child. The child was small, barely 6 or 7, with short dark hair matted against their head from the cold. Their coat was too thin for the frigid air, and they huddled against the wind, pulling it tighter around their small frame as they stumbled through the snow-covered street. Their breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, visible in the cold air like clouds of smoke. The child's footsteps faltered, as if they were losing the strength to keep moving, their legs growing tired beneath them. The street stretched ahead, empty and endless. The child looked around frantically, their eyes darting in every direction, trying to make sense of their surroundings. But there was nothing. No one. The child opened their mouth to cry out again, their voice breaking the deathly silence. "Mom! Dad! Where are you?" Their voice was thin and desperate, and the words echoed into the cold, barren air. The sound seemed to fall flat against the nothingness. No one answered. The child's eyes filled with tears, and they wiped them away quickly, afraid that if they allowed themselves to cry too much, they might not be able to stop. But the tears kept coming, cold, freezing instantly on their cheeks as they trembled. They looked to the horizon, hoping to see some sign of life, but only the empty street met their gaze. Their heart began to pound faster. The fear was crawling up their throat, a feeling they couldn't escape, a sensation that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The snow began to fall harder now, thick, heavy flakes swirling around the child's head, the wind picking up in intensity. The cold was seeping into their bones, but the real chill, the one they couldn't shake, was the one coming from within. Something was out there. Something was watching them. With a deep breath, the child forced themselves to keep moving, their steps unsteady in the deepening snow. The world felt like it was closing in around them, the street narrowing, the shadows growing longer. Every corner they turned revealed nothing but more emptiness. The child's eyes darted to the trees lining the side of the road, their gnarled branches moving in the wind, and it was then that the child noticed something. A shift in the air, a disturbance, something unnatural. The child froze. They could hear something, no, feel something, moving in the distance. The wind howled louder, swirling around them like a cyclone, and suddenly the sound came clearer, a low, throaty growl, deep and menacing. The child's heart skipped a beat, their legs going numb beneath them as their instincts screamed for them to run. The growl wasn't from any animal they knew. It wasn't a dog or a fox. It was something larger, something darker. The sound was animalistic, but it carried an unnatural weight to it, something primal, a warning. The child's head snapped in the direction of the noise, but all they could see was darkness, trees swaying in the wind, shadows twisting and moving, and then another growl. This time it was closer, so much closer. The child's breath caught in their throat, their eyes wide with terror. Their small hands gripped their coat, tightening around the fabric, as they slowly began to back up, heart pounding in their chest. The sound of snow crunching beneath their feet seemed unbearably loud in the silence that followed. With each step they took, the growling grew louder, more pronounced. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever was out there was approaching, and fast. The child spun around, looking for any way to escape, any way to get away, but there was nothing. Nothing but the swirling darkness around them. The street was empty, the trees empty, the shadows deep and consuming. Another growl came, so loud it rattled their bones. And then they saw them. Emerging from the trees, moving with terrifying grace, came the first wolf. Its massive form stepped out of the shadows, its eyes glowing like twin coals in the dark. The fur was thick, glistening in the dim light, rippling with muscle as it moved toward the child. The creature's gaze was fixed on them, locked with an intensity that froze the child's heart in their chest. Its growl reverberated in the air, sending shivers through the child's body, but it didn't move closer. Not yet. The child's body went rigid with fear. They had never seen a wolf this large. The creature's presence was suffocating, filling the air with an ominous weight. The child took a step back, their heart hammering, the snow beneath their feet seeming to freeze in place. Then, from the shadows, more wolves appeared, one by one, eyes glowing, teeth bared, their massive bodies emerging from the dark like shadows of death. The child tried to scream, but no sound escaped. Their legs were like jelly, their body too paralyzed with terror to move. The wolves circled them, slowly, methodically. There was no escape now. The child's breath was shallow, quick, as they turned, trying to see where they could run. But the wolves were everywhere, silent and deadly, their eyes never leaving the child. One by one they closed in, and the growl deepened, filling the night with a chilling sound, a sound that would forever haunt the child's memory. The snowflakes seemed to dance in the air, swirling around them like tiny ghosts as the wolves closed in. The child's eyes searched the shadows in desperation. They were trapped, completely and utterly trapped. There was nowhere to go, no one to help them. The wolves were too many, too powerful, and they were closing in for the kill. But then, there was a shift. The air grew heavier, a sudden crackle in the atmosphere, as though something was stirring within the wolves themselves. The child's heart beat so loudly in their chest it felt as though it would burst. And then, as the circle of wolves closed tighter, they saw it. A pair of glowing eyes appeared from the darkness, but these were not the eyes of a wolf. The growls that echoed in the silence of the night seemed to reverberate through the child's chest, the deep, guttural sound vibrating in the air. The wolves, at least half a dozen of them, emerged from the trees like shadows, moving silently but with purpose. The snow, which had been falling gently just moments ago, now seemed to fall in slow motion, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The first wolf, the largest of the pack, stepped into the dim light cast by the flickering street lamp. Its coat was as black as the night itself, sleek and glossy, shimmering as it moved. The beast's eyes, glowing with an unnatural yellow intensity, locked onto the child's wide, terrified gaze. A low growl rumbled deep in its chest, sending a ripple of dread down the child's spine. The child's entire body tensed. Their mind screamed at them to run, to turn and flee, but their legs refused to obey. Fear had seized them in place, their feet as frozen in the snow as if the ground itself had trapped them. They stood motionless, breathing heavily, the cold air stinging their lungs, but it was the wolves that took center stage now, their eyes glowing in the night, the ominous growls rolling like distant thunder. The lead wolf's head tilted slightly, as though it were studying the child, its eyes narrowing, contemplating its next move. The child felt a chill crawl up their spine as the pack of wolves slowly fanned out, forming a loose circle around them. The pack was massive, towering, their muscular bodies blending into the shadows of the night. The child couldn't move, couldn't even speak. Every instinct screamed for them to act, to do something, but fear had rooted them to the spot, the weight of their helplessness suffocating them. Their heart thudded painfully in their chest, each beat growing louder in their ears. A tremor ran through their legs, and they clenched their fists, trying to steady themselves. But it was useless. The wolves were too close now. The child's eyes darted from one wolf to the next. They each had glowing eyes, each a different shade of amber or yellow, burning bright against the dark of the night. The wolves moved in perfect unison, their movements fluid, graceful, as if they were one entity, a terrifying, seamless whole. The only sounds that could be heard were the soft crunch of their paws in the snow and the rhythmic growls that filled the air. The child couldn't help but notice that these wolves weren't like the ones they had seen before, the ones they had read about in books or seen in documentaries. These wolves seemed different, larger, more dangerous, but there was something else, something unsettling. They didn't look hungry, at least not in the way a predator might look at its prey. No, their eyes were sharp, calculating, and their behavior was deliberate, almost as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the moment. The largest wolf, the one that had initially stepped forward, let out a low snarl that made the air feel colder. The other wolves responded in kind, their growls synchronizing into a deep, resonant chorus that made the child's blood run cold. The pack closed the distance between them, each step measured and deliberate. The child tried to take a step back, but their legs felt like lead. They couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go. A wave of dizziness hit them, their vision blurring for a moment. Their thoughts became disjointed, the overwhelming terror beginning to take over, drowning out their ability to think clearly. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? Trapped in the snow, surrounded by a pack of wolves, with no one coming to help? Their chest tightened and their hands began to shake. The snow around them was still falling, but it was as though the world had stopped moving, frozen in place, just like the child. They could hear their own heartbeat now, frantic and wild, like the thundering hooves of a stampede. Suddenly, the lead wolf took another step forward. The snow beneath its paws seemed to shift with a disturbing softness, as though the creature was moving effortlessly across the frozen ground. Its massive body was almost overwhelming to look at, the muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. But it didn't strike. Not yet. It seemed to be waiting for something, just like the rest of the pack. The child's breath quickened, their mind racing to find a solution, to do anything. Their eyes flicked to the trees, looking for a way to climb up, to escape. But the branches were too high, and the trunks were too smooth. The wolves would have no problem following them. The child was completely trapped. The wolf continued to advance, moving with a deliberate slowness, as though savoring the fear in the child's eyes. The growls were a constant low rumble now, filling the silence of the night with their primal power. Every part of the child's body screamed at them to move, to do something, but they couldn't. And then, just as the lead wolf came within a few feet of the child, it paused. The air seemed to freeze, the silence so thick it felt suffocating. For a moment, the only sound was the wind, which had picked up once more, swirling around the scene like a ghostly presence. The child's eyes never left the massive wolf's gaze. They were paralyzed, unable to look away. It was like a hypnotic trance, a battle of wills, and the child was losing. The child's mind was racing, thoughts scrambling. What was it waiting for? Why hadn't it attacked? Why hadn't any of them attacked? The child's breathing became more ragged, more desperate. The wolf's eyes never left them, but then, in a strange, almost subtle shift, the wolf lowered its head slightly, as though considering something. The other wolves paused too, the entire pack seemingly still, their heads tilted, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. The atmosphere had changed. What had been a circle of danger, a tightening noose, now felt like a waiting game. The wolves weren't attacking. But why? The child dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly. Every fiber of their being was on edge, every sense heightened. They waited for the strike, the moment when the wolves would lunge. But that moment never came. The leader of the pack let out a low, almost inquisitive sound, a mix of a growl and a whine, and the other wolves mirrored its actions. The child's heart skipped a beat. What did this mean? Was it toying with them? Toying with its prey? The wolves closed in a little more, their eyes burning bright. The child could feel their warmth, their presence, a tangible, palpable force that surrounded them. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, the wolves weren't attacking. Their jaws were slightly parted, their teeth visible, but they weren't rushing in for the kill. The child stood there, utterly still, caught in the moment. Were they being judged? Were the wolves testing them? Were they playing with their prey? The air was thick with tension. The growls had softened, but the silence between them was deafening. Then, without warning, the leader of the pack took another step forward, its massive body towering over the child. Its amber eyes never wavered from their gaze. And then, the strangest thing happened. The night had turned colder, the air sharper as the wolves began to close in around the child. The street lamp flickered above them, casting long, sinister shadows, and the snow continued to fall in heavy, relentless flakes, covering the ground in a thick, suffocating blanket. Each passing second seemed to stretch longer than the last, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of the wolves' fur and the crunch of snow under their heavy paws. The lead wolf, the largest of them all, took another slow, deliberate step forward. Its eyes burned with a fiery yellow intensity that seemed to pierce through the night, locking onto the child with terrifying focus. Its breath came in shallow, measured exhalations, puffing out in the frigid air like smoke from a dying fire. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment, the weight of the pack's presence closing in, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere itself had been manipulated to make the child feel even more isolated, more desperate. The child's heart pounded against their chest, each beat loud and frantic in their ears. Their breath came in short, panicked gasps, the cold making it harder to breathe. The thin coat they wore did little to protect them from the biting wind, and every breath they took felt like a knife stabbing into their lungs. But it wasn't the cold that had them frozen in place. It was the wolves. The primal fear of being hunted, of being stalked by creatures that were much stronger, much faster, and far more deadly than anything the child had ever known. The wolf in front of them stood still, its body perfectly still, yet its muscles rippled with the potential for violence. The child could feel the heat radiating off the beast, a heat that made them feel small and insignificant in comparison. The world around them seemed to shrink, the snow falling heavier, the silence growing thicker, and the growls from the other wolves surrounding them became a constant low hum, a reminder that they were not alone. There were too many of them, too many eyes locked onto them, too many heavy bodies moving with terrifying grace. The child stood there, paralyzed by fear, unable to make a sound. Every instinct screamed for them to run, to flee, but their body refused to obey. Their legs were like lead, too weak to move, and with every passing second, the wolves closed in. They were encircling the child now, forming a tight ring, each wolf moving slowly, methodically, like a clock winding down toward its inevitable conclusion. The child's eyes flicked from one wolf to another, their breathing shallow, their pulse racing. The smallest wolf, barely half the size of the lead, paced slowly behind them, its eyes narrowed, its head low, almost as though it were testing the air. It sniffed the ground, its nose twitching, and then it let out a low growl that sent a chill through the child's spine. The others followed suit, their growls merging into a low, rumbling chorus that seemed to vibrate in the child's very bones. The child's eyes darted to the street ahead of them, but the road stretched on in a long, unbroken line, empty and dark. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The snowflakes that had once seemed gentle now felt heavy, like they were bearing down on the child, each flake adding to the oppressive weight of the moment. The wolves were so close now, so close that the child could hear the soft rustle of their fur, the scrape of their claws against the snow, their breath hot and heavy in the cold night air. And then, the leader of the pack, the largest wolf, made its move. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed, it lunged forward. The child's breath caught in their throat, their bodies stiffening in terror as the massive wolf's jaws snapped inches from their face. The sheer force of its movement sent a gust of wind rippling through the snow, and the child recoiled instinctively, taking a step back, but there was nowhere to go. The pack had them surrounded. The child's heart raced faster, the beat pounding in their ears. The air around them seemed to constrict, suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. The wolves were like shadows, their eyes glowing like burning embers in the dark, their bodies moving fluidly, silently. The child couldn't help but feel as though they were no longer a part of this world, no longer a part of the living, breathing world outside of this frozen street. It was as if they had stepped into a nightmare, one where every move was calculated, where every step brought them closer to something they could not escape. The child tried to scream, but the sound died in their throat, swallowed by the night. They tried to move, to run, but their legs refused to obey, locked in place by terror. They could feel their own pulse in their throat now, each beat like a drum, reminding them of how little time they had. The wolves were closing in faster, their movements fluid, each of them as large as a grown man, their claws scraping against the pavement, their teeth gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't just the size of the wolves that terrified the child. It was the feeling that something else was happening here, something beyond simple predation. The wolves weren't attacking. They weren't charging at the child like a wild animal might. No, they were waiting, watching, circling like predators, testing their prey's resolve, sensing the fear emanating from the child like a wave in the air. They could smell it, the child's fear, palpable in the cold night, thick and heavy. The largest wolf, the leader of the pack, was the first to speak. Its growl was low and menacing, vibrating the air like thunder before a storm. But it wasn't just any growl. It was different, deeper, like it was trying to communicate something. The child's mind raced to comprehend what it meant, but all they could do was tremble, their bodies shaking from head to toe, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The other wolves paused, their growls quieting for just a moment, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something. The child looked at each of the wolves in turn, their eyes wild with panic, trying to find some sign of weakness, some way to break free from their terrifying gaze. But there was none. The wolves were a perfect unit, a deadly machine, each movement synchronized with the others, their eyes glowing, their jaws bared. Then, with a sudden movement, the largest wolf took another step forward. The child's body instinctively recoiled, but there was no escape. The wolf's eyes never left them, burning with an intensity that seemed to bore through to the very core of their being. The wolf's massive head lowered slightly, its snout mere inches from the child's face. The air between them was thick, charged with an electric energy, and the child could feel the heat from the wolf's body radiating out like a furnace. Every fiber of their being screamed to run, but their legs betrayed them. A single, low growl escaped the wolf's throat, this one softer, almost curious, as though it were testing the child, seeing how they would react. The pack behind the leader watched in silence, their eyes glowing brighter in the darkness, their movements still. They were like statues, waiting, watching, judging. The child's breath caught in their throat, their thoughts a whirlwind of terror. What did they want? Why weren't they attacking? Why were they just waiting? The tension in the air became unbearable. The silence between the growls felt oppressive, heavy. And just when the child thought they couldn't stand it anymore, when they were sure their heart would burst from their chest, the unexpected happened. The tension was unbearable. Time seemed to stretch out, each second hanging in the air like a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. The child stood in the center of the snow-covered street, surrounded by the pack of wolves, their amber eyes burning into them like twin flames. The night had turned suffocating, the cold so sharp that it cut into the child's skin, but it was the wolves' unblinking gaze that chilled them to the bone. The wolves had not attacked, not yet. They circled the child, each movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Their growls had softened to low rumbles, almost as if they were communicating amongst themselves, and for the first time, the child began to notice something strange, something that didn't quite make sense. These wolves weren't behaving like the savage predators the child had imagined. They weren't rabid, hungry animals driven by instinct alone. There was a method to their movements, an intelligence behind their eyes that felt almost human. The lead wolf, the largest of them all, continued to keep its distance, observing the child with a curious intensity. It didn't lunge, didn't strike. It simply watched, its yellow eyes burning with that eerie glow, as if it were studying the child, testing them. The child's breath came in shallow gasps, their heart pounding with a desperate rhythm. Every instinct screamed for them to run, but their legs felt as though they were made of stone. The weight of the wolf's gaze kept them rooted in place, as though some invisible force was keeping them from escaping. The air was thick with tension, every moment stretching longer than the last. The child's hands shook uncontrollably, their fists clenched tightly by their sides. They could feel the wolves getting closer, inching forward as though the pack was closing in for the final strike. But nothing happened. The largest wolf took another step forward, its massive form casting a long shadow over the child. The child could feel the heat radiating off its body, an unsettling warmth that made the cold seem even more unbearable. Yet, it did not attack. The silence between them was profound, almost deafening. The only sounds were the soft crunch of snow beneath the wolf's paws and the child's panicked breathing. The child's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Why hadn't they attacked yet? Why were they just circling, observing? The child's eyes darted from one wolf to another, trying to gauge their next move. Each wolf's eyes glowed in the darkness, their presence a silent, looming threat. There was something about their calm demeanor, their lack of aggression, that made the situation even more unsettling. Were they toying with the child? Was this some kind of game? Or was something else at play here? A flash of memory, of stories and myths they'd heard about wolves, flickered in the child's mind. Wolves were pack animals, territorial creatures that hunted together. But they were also intelligent, calculating, with a complex social structure. The child had read about them, studied them in books, but nothing had prepared them for this. This pack of wolves wasn't acting like any pack the child had ever imagined. They weren't just mindless predators, they were something else. Something different. The largest wolf let out another low growl, but this time it wasn't directed at the child. It seemed to be a signal, a command, and the other wolves responded immediately. They shifted slightly, closing the circle a little tighter. The child's body tensed. The wolves were moving in unison now, their movements so fluid and synchronized that it was as if they were one single cohesive force. The child's thoughts began to spiral. Was this the moment? Was the pack finally going to strike? The fear tightened in their chest, making it hard to breathe. They could feel their body trembling, their legs like jelly beneath them. It was as though every muscle was frozen in place, unwilling to move. And then, just as the child thought they couldn't take it anymore, something unexpected happened. The largest wolf, the one that had been leading the pack, took another step forward, but this time, its movements were slower, more deliberate. The child's heart skipped a beat. What was it doing? Was it finally going to attack? But it didn't. Instead, the wolf lowered its massive head slowly, bringing its snout close to the child's face. The child's breath caught in their throat as the wolf's hot breath washed over them, filling their nostrils with the scent of fur and wildness. The child couldn't move, couldn't speak, their body paralyzed by the proximity of the beast. The wolf's eyes never left theirs. Those glowing yellow orbs locked onto them with an intensity that felt as though the wolf were seeing straight through them, into their very soul. The wolf's growl softened, transforming into a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate the air between them. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't the growl of a predator about to strike. It was something else, something far more puzzling. The wolf's body shifted slightly, its muscles rippling under its thick fur, and the other wolves in the pack followed suit. They mirrored the lead wolf's movements, stepping closer, their eyes still fixed on the child, but there was no aggression in their stance, no hunger. It was as if they were waiting for something that only they knew. The child felt as though they were at the center of some complex, incomprehensible ritual, like a pawn in a game they didn't understand. The stillness was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity. The child's chest tightened. They were waiting. The wolves were waiting. What were they waiting for? Was it a test? Were they trying to see how the child would react? The thought sent a wave of confusion through their mind. The pack's behavior had become so unpredictable, so unnerving, that the child could no longer make sense of it. There was no primal, hungry rush to the kill, no frenzied attack. It was something different, something deeper, something far more dangerous. The child's legs shook beneath them, and the snow beneath their feet felt as though it had frozen solid, anchoring them to the ground. The wolves were still circling, moving in tighter. Each time they took a step forward, the child instinctively took a step back, but there was no escaping. The pack was closing in on them. The lead wolf's head lifted slowly, its glowing eyes never leaving the child. It made another low sound, half growl, half whine, almost as if it were asking a question. The child felt a cold shiver run down their spine. What did it mean? Was it some kind of sign? Or was it simply a sign of the predator's patience? The wolves had been calm, almost eerily so. But now, there was something different in the air. Something more charged. The world around the child had gone silent. The wind, the snow, everything seemed to hold its breath. Even the wolves had paused, standing still for the first time since the child had entered their circle. The world felt suspended, as if everything was waiting for one single moment to unfold. The child's heartbeat was deafening in their ears. Their breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. Every muscle in their body screamed for them to move, but they were frozen in place. Suddenly, the smallest of the wolves broke the silence. It moved forward, closer to the child, its eyes softening just slightly. It nuzzled the child's leg gently, a motion so unexpected, so out of place, that it made the child flinch in shock. The other wolves remained still, their gaze fixed on the interaction. For a moment, the child stood in complete confusion. What was happening? Why was the pack not attacking? Why was the smallest wolf acting as if it were calming them? The weight of the moment felt even heavier. The child's brain couldn't process what was happening. There was no logical explanation for this strange behavior. The air felt dense, thick with expectation, as though the wolves were waiting for the child to make the first move, to do something. The uncertainty, the anxiety, the lack of action, everything felt like a ticking time bomb. What did the wolves want? And why hadn't they attacked? The child stood motionless, their breath visible in the frigid air, the cold biting into their skin as the pack of wolves began to retreat. But nothing about the moment felt right. The very ground beneath them felt frozen, not from the snow that had accumulated in the streets, but from the unease that gripped their heart. It didn't make sense. Just moments before, they had been surrounded by the pack, ready to be torn apart by the savage jaws of the wolves. Now, they were backing away as if something had shifted. The tension was thick enough to cut through with a knife. The largest wolf, its amber eyes locked with the child's, had led the retreat. It moved slowly, cautiously, as though it were calculating its next move. And the other wolves followed, step by careful step, each one watching the child as if they were the most important thing in the world. The child's legs were shaky, their knees wobbling from a mixture of fear and the intense cold. The sound of their pulse drummed in their ears as they slowly took a step backward. They had no idea why the wolves weren't attacking. There was no reason for the pack to show mercy. Wolves didn't have mercy. They hunted. But this was different. The wolves weren't moving in for the kill. They were pulling back. The smallest wolf, which had nuzzled the child's leg moments ago, gave a final glance over its shoulder before it followed the pack into the night. The other wolves, one by one, faded into the darkness, their glowing eyes the only trace they left behind. The child stood there, frozen in place, their breath coming in sharp gasps. They were confused, caught in a whirlwind of emotions: relief, disbelief, fear, and wonder. Was it over? Had they escaped? Was the worst behind them? The child couldn't move. Their mind reeled, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Why hadn't the wolves attacked? They had been so close to death, so close to being ripped apart by the pack's jaws. But now, the night was eerily silent. The wolves were gone. The pack had vanished into the shadows like wraiths. The only sound that remained was the wind howling through the desolate streets, its mournful cry filling the empty air. Suddenly, in the distance, a sound reached the child's ears. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a shout, a call, their name. The voice was distant, but it carried clearly in the stillness of the night. It was a human voice, rough and urgent, carrying with it a sense of desperation. The child's heart skipped a beat. They turned, eyes wide with disbelief. Could it be? Had someone else heard the commotion? Were they coming to help? The sound of the voice grew louder. The child could now hear the urgency, the panic in the voice. It was definitely a human, but who was it? And where were they? The child hesitated, torn between staying where they were, still processing the fact that they were alive, and running toward the distant voice. The fear and confusion that had kept them frozen in place began to wear off, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Who was calling them? Was it someone from the wolves' pack trying to lure them out? Or was it someone, maybe even a rescuer, sent to pull them out of the nightmare? The child's legs still felt like jelly, but their instincts kicked in. They couldn't just stand here, couldn't just wait. They needed answers. The cold air burned their lungs, but they managed to stumble forward, moving away from where the wolves had disappeared, toward the sound of the voice. But just as they took the first few steps, a movement in the shadows caught their attention. It was so fast, so sudden, that they nearly missed it. There, just beyond the street lamp's dim glow, something was shifting, something large and dark. The child's heart stopped. Another wolf. But this one was different. It wasn't one of the pack that had just backed away. This one was larger, much larger. Its eyes burned bright like molten gold, and it moved with a predatory grace that sent chills down the child's spine. The child froze again, their body paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of the massive creature. This wolf was not like the others. This was something else, something far more dangerous. The wolf's gaze locked onto the child, and in that instant, everything around them seemed to blur. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. The night felt colder than it ever had before, and the child could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The wolf did not move, but its stare was piercing, as if it could see directly into the child's soul. It stood there, watching them, unmoving, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with an energy that seemed ready to explode at any moment. The child felt trapped again. The relief they had just begun to savor evaporated like smoke, replaced by the cold, suffocating fear that the predator was just waiting for the right moment to strike. But then, something changed. The massive wolf took a step forward, but instead of attacking, it lowered its head, almost in a gesture of recognition. The child's confusion deepened. What did this mean? Why wasn't it attacking? In that moment, the child realized that something was happening, something beyond their comprehension. This wolf, this enormous, powerful creature, was not just another predator. It was different. The child's instinct told them that the animal wasn't merely hunting, it was making a choice. And in that choice, everything felt precariously suspended. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the massive wolf stood before the child, its amber eyes unblinking, intense, and unyielding. The cold air burned in the child's lungs, each breath coming in sharp gasps. Their body was frozen, both from the physical cold and the paralyzing fear. The massive wolf towered over them, its fur rippling with power, muscles taut beneath the thick coat. The child was caught between terror and confusion, unable to move, unable to look away from those eyes that seemed to pierce right into their soul. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, and the silence between them became unbearable. The wolf's presence was overwhelming. Its gaze never faltered, its posture perfect, standing still, its every movement deliberate. The child didn't know what to do, didn't know if they should run, scream, or simply collapse in defeat. Then, just as they thought they might crumble under the weight of the moment, something happened. Another noise, more distant this time, cut through the stillness. A low, rumbling sound, like thunder reverberating through the earth. It was not from the massive wolf in front of them, but something deeper, something more ancient, something primal. It felt like the world was shaking, as if a warning had been issued, a force too powerful to ignore. The child's eyes flickered to the source of the noise, just in time to see movement in the darkness. Figures, shapes, appearing out of the shadows. But these figures were different. They weren't just ordinary people. They moved with a certain fluidity, a grace, almost as if they were part of the night itself. For a split second, the child wondered if they were seeing things. Could this all be some kind of hallucination brought on by the overwhelming fear? But no, they weren't hallucinations. They were real. The figures emerged into the dim light of the street lamps, and the child could see them clearly now. They were people, humans, yes, but they weren't alone. Behind them, a dozen wolves moved in the shadows, watching the child with a curiosity that mirrored the same strange intelligence the large wolf had displayed. The humans stepped forward, calling to the child in soft, reassuring voices, but the child could hardly hear them. The wolves had stopped, remaining still, as if waiting for some sort of signal. The larger wolf, the one that had first lunged toward the child, had not backed down. Instead, it seemed to be awaiting a decision. The tension between the wolves and the humans was palpable, and the child could feel every heartbeat thundering in their chest. But the larger wolf did not attack. Instead, it stepped aside, allowing the humans to approach. It was as though it had been waiting for their arrival, waiting for the right moment to yield. The humans moved with purpose, not afraid, not uncertain. They approached the child slowly, as if guiding them through some unspoken ritual. In the quiet stillness of the night, the child was finally able to move. Still shaken, their legs felt like jelly beneath them, but they managed to take a step forward. They looked back at the large wolf, whose amber eyes never left their face, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the child realized they were free. The wolves had retreated. The humans were there, offering their protection. The massive wolf finally stepped back completely, disappearing into the shadows of the night, its presence fading with each passing second. The child breathed a sigh of relief, their body trembling with exhaustion. They had been on the edge of death, trapped between a pack of wolves and the darkness. And now, as the wolves faded into the night, they realized something even more unsettling. This wasn't over, not yet. The world had just shifted in ways the child couldn't fully understand. And as the humans led them away from the street, toward a new place of safety, the child couldn't shake the feeling that this strange, terrifying encounter was only the beginning. As the humans led the child through the winding, snowy streets, the wolves kept their distance, blending into the darkness like shadows. The child could feel the presence of something ancient, something beyond their understanding, watching from the periphery of the streetlights. They had survived, yes, but the overwhelming questions lingered in their mind. Why had the wolves retreated? What was the connection between the strange, mysterious humans and the wolves? Though the danger had passed for now, the child could sense that the story was far from over. The world had changed tonight, and they had become part of something much larger than themselves. There were no answers yet, only more mysteries, more questions than ever before. As the child walked into the warmth of the shelter the humans had brought them to, they could still hear the faint howls in the distance, echoing across the icy expanse of the town. The wolves were still out there, watching, waiting. The tension in the air still lingered, and though the child was safe for now, they couldn't shake the feeling that something far more dangerous loomed on the horizon. The pack had not left forever. They would return. But by then, the child hoped they'd have answers. The door to the shelter creaked open as the child stepped inside, the warmth enveloping them, easing the biting cold from their bones. They were alive. They had escaped. For now, that was all that mattered, but the journey had only just begun. The mysteries of the night, the wolves, the humans, everything that had happened was just the beginning. And as the door closed behind them, shutting out the dark and freezing night, the child couldn't help but feel that their life had changed forever. And there you have it. An incredible, heart-pounding adventure that leaves us with more questions than answers. What will happen next? What is the true connection between the wolves and the humans? And what fate lies ahead for the child? We hope you enjoyed this thrilling journey and that it keeps you on the edge of your seat long after the video ends. If you like the story and want to know what happens next, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Your support means everything, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting stories just like this one. So hit that bell icon to be the first to know when we upload new content, and be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for watching till the end, and stay tuned for the next chapter in this epic tale. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the greatest mysteries are yet to be discovered. See you next time.